The night the storm came, it didn't just bring snow, it carried betrayal. A pregnant widow, locked inside a freezing barn by her own family, was left to die. But fate had other plans. When a scarred drifter stepped through the storm, no one could have imagined that this meeting would ignite a battle not just for survival, but for justice, dignity, and the very meaning of humanity. Stay with me, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about strength and kindness.
The iron hinges shrieked. Then came the heavy thud. The lock snapped shut. Clara was on the wrong side of the heavy oak door. She was trapped inside the freezing barn. Outside, the blizzard of 1878 was howling like a starved wolf. She was 6 months pregnant. She wore nothing but a thin cotton mourning dress. Her husband wasn't even cold in his grave yet, and her own in-laws had just handed her a death sentence. They wanted the land, they wanted the house, and they figured a winter storm was the cheapest way to dig a grave. The wind cut through the gaps in the weathered barn wood. It felt like rusted blades against her skin. Clara shivered violently. She sank to her knees in the dry hay. She wrapped her pale arms around her swollen belly. She had to protect the baby, but just as importantly, she had to protect the floorboards directly beneath her boots. An hour passed, maybe 2. The biting cold was starting to make her feel warm. Sleepy. She knew what that meant. Sleep meant death. Her eyelids fluttered. She leaned against a wooden post, waiting for the end. Suddenly, a massive crack echoed louder than the storm. It wasn't thunder, it was wood splintering. The main barn doors burst inward. A wall of snow blasted into the darkness. And then a shadow stepped through. He was a mountain of a man. He stood 6'6" if he was an inch. His broad shoulders completely blocked out the howling wind. He struck a sulfur match against the doorframe. The tiny, flickering yellow flame lit up his face. Scars crawled up his jawline. A broken nose. Cold, hardened eyes. His name was Elias, a drifter, the kind of giant folks crossed the street to avoid. He shook the snow from his hat. Then, the matchlight caught Clara. She was huddled in the corner, barely breathing, blue lips. Elias didn't hesitate. He dropped his heavy saddlebags. He crossed the dirt floor in 3 massive, heavy strides. He didn't ask questions. He just shrugged off his thick, sheepskin-lined coat and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The coat swallowed her whole. It was heavy. It smelled of wood smoke and wet leather. "We gotta move you, ma'am." His voice was like grinding stones. Deep, rough. "You stay in this barn. You and the little one are gonna freeze solid before morning. There's a neighboring farm about a mile down the ridge. I can carry you." He reached his massive hands down to lift her. Clara shoved her frozen hands against his chest. She didn't budge him an inch, but her eyes stopped him cold. They weren't defeated. They were fierce, burning bright in the dim light. "No," she wheezed. Her voice cracked from the freezing air, but her words were steady. She grabbed his sleeve tightly. "Listen to me," Clara said, forcing herself to sit up straight, looking right into the giant's eyes. "Don't take me away. You think the blizzard is the worst thing out there? It's not. Our greatest enemy isn't the cold out there. It's the cruelty inside the hearts of our own blood. If I leave, their malice and greed win. They threw me out to steal what's right. I stay right here. Because standing your ground against evil is the only way to prove that justice means something. No one has the right to treat another human being like garbage to serve their own greed." Elias froze. His massive hands hovered in the air. He had been beaten, chased, and spat on his whole life. But he had never heard anyone speak like that. He looked at the small, freezing woman. He looked at the locked door. And then he looked down at the specific spot on the floorboards she was so desperately guarding. The barn was dead quiet, save for the wind screaming outside. Elias didn't move, he just stared. He looked at the freezing woman. He looked at the floorboards she was guarding. He didn't ask her to explain, not yet. First things first. They needed heat. Elias turned his back to her. He walked to the far end of the barn. The shadows swallowed him whole. There was an old horse stall back there, rotted pine. It hadn't held a horse in years. He grabbed the top rail. His massive hands gripped the dry wood. He pulled. The wood shrieked. Then it snapped. He didn't use an axe. He didn't use a saw. Just raw, terrifying strength. He carried the splintered wood back. He found a rusted metal wash tub in the corner of the barn. He kicked it to the center of the dirt floor, safely away from the dry hay. He broke the wood over his knee, stacked the pieces in the tub. He struck another sulfur match against his boot. Soon a fire cracked. The flames licked the dry pine. Black smoke curled up toward the high, pitch-black rafters. Warmth, real, biting warmth. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It came out as a thick white cloud. She inched closer to the tub. Her hands were blue. Now, slowly, they were turning red. The pain of thawing out was awful. It felt like 1,000 needles under her skin. It hurt worse than the cold, but it meant she was alive. Elias sat across the fire. He sat cross-legged on the frozen dirt. Even sitting down, he was huge. He pulled a battered tin flask from his coat pocket, unscrewed the cap, took a slow, deliberate pull. He wiped his scarred mouth with the back of his hand. He looked right at her. "You're thawing," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel rolling down a tin roof. Clara nodded slowly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Morning is a long way off." He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the floor, right at the spot where she had been sitting. "What's under the wood, ma'am?" Clara stiffened. She pulled his heavy sheepskin coat tighter around her shoulders. She looked down at the dirt. "Nothing," she lied. It was a bad lie. Her voice shook, not from the cold this time, but from fear. Elias sighed, a heavy, tired sound. He had heard lies all his life. He knew what they sounded like. "Lady," he said quietly, "I'm a drifter. I've been shot at. I've been chased out of more towns than I can count. I know when folks are trying to kill someone. Your family didn't lock you in a freezing barn just to be mean." He leaned forward. The orange firelight danced across his face. It highlighted the brutal, jagged scar across his cheek. It highlighted his broken nose. "Mean is a slap," Elias continued. "Mean is stealing a horse, leaving a pregnant widow to freeze to death in a winter storm. That's business. They want something, and they want you out of the way to get it." He looked at the floorboards again. "You were guarding that spot, like a junkyard dog guards a bone. I ain't a thief. I don't care about gold. But if we're going to survive the night, I need to know what I'm protecting." Clara stared at him. She really looked at him this time. His face was brutal. He looked like a monster out of a dime novel. But his eyes were different. His eyes were quiet, sad even. There was no greed in them, just a weary kind of honesty. She made a choice. She had to trust him. She had no one else. She nodded at the floorboards. "There's a loose nail, third board from the main center post." Elias stood up. He walked over to the spot. He pulled a hunting knife from his thick leather belt. The blade was heavy and dull. He wedged it into the crack under the oak board. He leaned his weight into the handle. The rusty nails groaned in protest. They popped free with a sharp squeal. He pulled the heavy board back. Underneath was just frozen, packed dirt and a small rusted iron lockbox. He reached down into the dark cavity. He pulled the box out. It was heavy. He brought it back to the fire. He set it on the dirt right between them. "Open it," Elias said. Clara reached out from under the giant coat. Her fingers still trembled slightly. She fumbled with the metal latch. It wasn't locked with a key. She had just kept it hidden in the dark. She flipped the heavy iron lid back. Elias leaned in. He expected gold coins, or banknotes, or fancy jewelry, the kind of things rich folks killed each other over. Instead, he saw paper, thick, heavy parchment paper, folded neatly. tied with a faded blue ribbon. Elias frowned, his thick brows pulled together. Paper? Your own blood wants to kill you over paper? Clara carefully lifted the documents from the box. She held them like they were made of fragile glass. "This is my husband's true will," she said softly. Her voice finally found its strength. The tremble was gone. "The one his family filed at the courthouse in town is a forgery. This is the real one, written in his own hand, witnessed by the circuit judge." Elias shook his massive head. He didn't understand the law. He only understood survival. "So it gives you the ranch," Elias said. "Why not just burn the barn down with you in it? Why freeze you out like an animal?" "Because if I die naturally in a winter storm, there is no crime," Clara explained. "They inherit everything as his closest living blood kin. If they burn the barn, the sheriff might start asking questions. They want it to look like a tragic accident." She unfolded the thick parchment. The firelight caught the black ink. "But it doesn't just give me the ranch, Elias. That's not what makes them so desperate. That's not what makes them murderous." Elias squinted at her. "Then what does it do?" "It gives the ranch away," Clara said. Elias blinked. "Come again?" "My husband and we didn't want a cattle empire. We didn't want to build a kingdom on the backs of poor men. We wanted to help people. This will dictate that the entire estate, all the land, all the money in the bank is to be put into a public trust." She traced the ink with her finger. "To build a clinic, right here on this very land. A free medical clinic." Elias stared at the paper. Then he looked around the drafty, rotting barn. "A clinic, out here?" "Yes, for everyone. Not just the wealthy landowners who can afford a doctor from the city, but for the ranch hands, the immigrants laying the railroad tracks, the native families pushed to the edge of the territory. Anyone who is sick, anyone who is hurt, they will be treated here without charge." She reached into the box again. She pulled out a second stack of papers. They were rougher, yellowed at the edges. "And these," Clara said, her voice swelling with emotion, "these are freedom papers, deeds of release for every single indentured hand currently working on this land. It forgives all their debts to the company store. It makes them free men, entirely clear of any obligation to my husband's family." Elias sat back. He felt like he had been kicked squarely in the chest by a draft horse. He looked at the papers. Then he looked down at his own hands. They were covered in scars, broken knuckles, calluses as thick as boot leather, used hands, beaten hands. He took a deep, shaky breath. The cold air burned his lungs. "My whole life," Elias started. His voice was lower now, almost a whisper. "Folks looked at me like a beast born to pull wagons out of the mud or throw punches in a dirt ring for $1 on a Saturday night. Nobody ever looked at me and saw a man." He pointed a thick, trembling finger at the papers in her lap. "This paper, does it really say a drifter's life is worth the same as a mayor's? Does it say my blood is the same color as the men who locked you in here to die?" Clara looked him dead in the eye. The fire sparked and popped between them. "Yes, Elias, it does." She leaned forward. Her voice was crystal clear. There was no hesitation, no implied meaning, just the absolute unvarnished truth. "We are all born equal, Elias. Every single human being. Your life holds the exact same value as any man who wears a silk suit or carries a silver sheriff's badge. That is a fundamental truth of this world. Human dignity is not something you earn with money or a fancy name. It is something you are born with. Every person deserves to be treated with respect, to be free from exploitation, and to have an equal chance at a decent life." Elias swallowed hard. The words hit him harder than any fist ever had. He felt a lump form in his thick throat. "Folks around here don't believe that," he said quietly. "I know," Clara replied. "That is exactly why they want me dead. If I survive this night, this will become the law of the land. The indentured men go free, The poor get medical care. The monopoly my in-laws have on this town, on the lives of these people, shatters completely. They don't just want my land, Elias. They want to crush the very idea that all people are created equal. Because if people believe they have basic human rights, my in-laws lose all their power. The wind battered against the barn doors. The storm was raging harder now, piling snow against the wood. But inside, sitting by the rusted tub, the air felt completely different. It felt heavy, important. Elias looked back at the fire. The pine snapped and hissed, throwing sparks into the dark. He had walked into this barn looking for a place to sleep, a place to hide from the cold. He didn't care about the town. He didn't care about the local squabbles over cattle and dirt. He was just passing through, like a ghost wandering the frontier. But a man can't walk away from someone who finally sees him as human. He looked back at Clara. She was small. She was shivering. She was pregnant and surrounded by vicious enemies. But she was holding the heaviest, most powerful thing he had ever seen in his life: the truth. Elias reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a heavy steel 6-shot revolver. The metal gleamed dangerously in the firelight. He checked the cylinder with a practiced flick of his wrist. Fully loaded. He snapped it shut with a sharp, echoing click. He rested the heavy gun on his knee. "You better put that paper back in the box, ma'am," Elias said calmly. Clara looked worried. "Why?" "Because if the storm breaks by dawn, they're going to come out here to collect your body." He stared at the barn doors, his jaw set like carved granite. His eyes were no longer sad. They were entirely focused. "And they're going to be mighty disappointed." Clara carefully folded the documents. She tied the faded blue ribbon in a tight bow. She placed them back into the rusted iron box and closed the lid. It shut with a dull, final thud. She slid the box back into the dark hole in the dirt. She looked at Elias. The giant cowboy wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring straight at the main doors, unblinking. "Are you staying, Elias?" she asked softly. He didn't turn his head. "I've been treated like a stray dog my whole life, Clara. I've been chased out of 20 towns. I never had a single reason to stand my ground and fight." He picked up a piece of scrap wood. He tossed it onto the dying fire. The flames flared up, bright and hot. But a world where a man is judged by his soul and not his scars, where a person has the undeniable right to be free and treated decent. He gripped the worn wooden handle of his revolver. His knuckles went white. "That sounds like a world worth fighting for. Go to sleep, ma'am. I've got the watch." Clara pulled his sheepskin coat tighter around her body. For the first time since her husband passed, she felt warm, deep down in her bones. The storm raged on outside in the dark, but the freezing cold couldn't touch them anymore. The secret was out in the open, and the giant had finally chosen his side. Morning broke over the territory like a cracked pane of ice, cold, blindingly bright. The blizzard had finally blown itself out. The wind was dead. The silence that followed was heavy. It hung over the snow-choked valley, suffocating and still. Footsteps crunched through the fresh, knee-deep powder. There were 3 men. Jebediah, Clara's father-in-law, led the way. He was a lean, hard man. His face was weathered like old saddle leather. His eyes were small, mean, and fixed dead on the barn. Behind him walked his 2 sons. They held their coat collars tight against their necks. They carried shovels. They didn't carry them to dig a grave. The ground was too frozen for that. They carried them to pry a frozen body off the dirt floor. Jebediah stopped a few yards from the barn doors. He chewed on a piece of tobacco. He spat a dark stream into the pristine white snow. "Should be done by now," Jebediah muttered. His breath plumed in the freezing air. "Ain't nobody surviving that storm. Not in a cotton dress. Not with a weak heart." He didn't sound sad. He sounded like a man checking a ledger, checking to see if a debt was cleared. He stepped up to the heavy oak doors. He reached for the iron padlock. His fingers were stiff from the cold, but he managed to turn the heavy key. The lock clicked. It sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet morning. He pulled the padlock free. He grabbed the iron handle. He hauled the right door open. Jebediah expected the stench of death. He expected to see a small, tragic lump of frost-covered clothes huddled in a dark corner. He had his story ready for the sheriff, a tragic wandering in the night. The poor widow lost her mind with grief, couldn't find her way back to the house in the whiteout. The door swung wide. Sunlight pierced the gloom of the barn. Jebediah froze. The air inside wasn't dead. It smelled of wood smoke, and burnt sulfur, and life. There, sitting on a sturdy wooden crate, was Clara. She was wrapped in a massive sheepskin-lined coat that engulfed her like a grizzly bear hide. Her face was pale, her lips were cracked, but she was sitting upright. She was breathing, and her eyes were wide open, staring right through him. Jebediah's jaw went slack. He took a step back. His son stopped behind him, shovels dropping low. "How?" Jebediah started. The word died in his throat. Then, the shadows moved. A figure detached itself from the dark corner behind Clara. He stepped into the shaft of morning light. He just kept stepping and stepping until his massive frame blocked out half the barn. It was Elias. He looked like something forged out of iron and bad weather. His face was a map of scars. His shoulders were wide enough to snap a doorway. In his right hand, resting easily against his hip, was a heavy steel Winchester rifle. He didn't point it at them. He didn't need to. The way his hand wrapped around the firing mechanism told them he knew exactly how to use it. In his massive left hand, he held a small, rusted iron box. Jebediah's eyes darted from the giant man to the box. The color drained from his weathered face. He recognized the rust patterns on that iron. "Who the hell are you?" Jebediah demanded. His voice shook, but he tried to mask it with anger. He reached a hand toward the revolver resting in his hip holster. "You're trespassing on my land, drifter." Elias didn't flinch. He didn't move his hand toward the trigger of his rifle. He just looked down at the older man. The look in his eyes wasn't angry. It was heavy, tired, like he had seen 1,000 men just like Jebediah, and was bored of every single one of them. "Not your land," Elias said. His voice rumbled out of his chest, deep and rough. "Never was." Jebediah's hand hovered over his gun. His son shifted nervously behind him. "I'm the legal kin. That girl there is out of her mind. You hand over that box, boy, and walk away. I'll let you leave this valley breathing." Clara stood up. Her legs were shaky. She leaned a hand against Elias's massive arm for support. The giant didn't move a muscle to let her steady herself. "You didn't come to collect a box, Jebediah," Clara said. Her voice was thin from the cold, but it carried. "You came to collect a corpse. You came to sweep away the last thing standing between you and the money you crave." She reached out. She took the iron box from Elias. She popped the latch. She pulled out the thick parchment paper tied with a faded blue ribbon. She held it up in the morning light. "This is Thomas's real will," she said. "Signed, sealed, witnessed by Judge Harmon in the next county over. It leaves everything to me, not to sell, not to profit, but to build a clinic for the people you've been bleeding dry for 20 years. Jebediah's face twisted into a snarl. The mask of the grieving father-in-law completely dropped. All that was left was pure, unadulterated greed. "That paper ain't worth a damn thing if you're both buried under the snow," Jebediah spat. He yanked his revolver from its holster. He didn't aim it at Elias. He aimed it squarely at Clara's chest. "Burn that paper, girl. Drop it in that fire right now, or I swear to God I'll put a bullet in you and tell the sheriff this drifter did it." The two sons raised their shovels, holding them like axes. They were ready for blood. The tension in the barn snapped tight like a tuned wire. Elias moved. He didn't raise the rifle. He didn't shout. He simply stepped sideways, placing his massive body entirely between Clara and Jebediah's gun. The barrel of the revolver was now pointed dead at the center of Elias's broad chest. "Go ahead," Elias said softly. Jebediah's hand shook. The giant was too close, too big. Elias took one slow step forward. The tip of Jebediah's gun barrel was now an inch from Elias's coat. "I've had guns pulled on me since I was 12 years old," Elias said. The rhythm of his voice was slow, deliberate. "I've been shot twice, stabbed 3 times. I know what a man looks like when he's ready to pull a trigger. You ain't ready. You're a coward who locks pregnant women in freezing barns because you don't have the spine to do your own killing." "Back off, giant," Jebediah stammered. The sweat was freezing on his forehead. Elias raised his left hand. Not to strike, but to point. He pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at the will in Clara's hand. "You see that paper?" Elias asked. His voice echoed off the wooden beams. "I spent my whole life using these fists to solve my problems. I broke men's jaws because they called me a beast. I used violence because it was the only language folks spoke to me. But she taught me something last night." Elias looked Jebediah dead in the eye. He made sure every single word landed with the weight of an anvil. "She taught me that violence only breeds new tyrants. If I take this rifle and blow you in half right now, I'm no better than you. I'm just a new thug standing on this dirt. We don't need another thug. We need the law. That will right there, that is the law. It's a promise written down that says a man's final wish matters. It says right is right and wrong is wrong. This will is what judges you, not my rifle." Jebediah swallowed hard. He looked at the giant. He looked at the heavy rifle resting in the giant's right hand. He realized with a sinking horror in his gut that Elias wasn't afraid of dying. And a man not afraid of dying is the most dangerous thing on the frontier. "The sheriff in town," Jebediah tried to bluster. "He's on my payroll. He won't care about that paper." "Maybe," Elias nodded slowly. "But the circuit judge who signed it will. The U.S. Marshals will. And if you pull that trigger, I promise you I will take that gun from your hand, I will break your arms, and I will march you all the way to the state capitol myself to hang you for murder. Lawfully." Elias took a deep breath. His chest expanded like a bellows. "So, you have a choice. You can die a criminal right here on this dirt. Or you can turn around, walk off her property, and never set foot on it again." The silence returned. The only sound was the drip of melting snow from the barn roof as the sun climbed higher. Jebediah looked at his sons. They were pale, shaking. They wanted no part of this giant. Slowly, Jebediah lowered his revolver. He didn't holster it, but he let it hang by his side. "This ain't over, Clara," Jebediah hissed over Elias's shoulder. "You can't run a ranch. You can't run a clinic. And you sure as hell can't keep a wild dog like him on a leash forever. The town will freeze you out. You'll starve." Clara stepped out from behind Elias. She stood tall. The shivering had stopped. "Get off my land, Jebediah." Jebediah spat in the snow one last time. He turned on his heel. He trudged back through the deep powder, his sons hurrying to keep pace ahead of him. Elias watched them go. He watched them until they were nothing but dark specks cresting the far ridge. Only then did he let out a long, slow breath. He reached over and gently pushed the safety catch on his Winchester. He turned to Clara. She was looking at him. Her eyes were shining with tears, but she wasn't crying. "You meant what you said," she whispered. "About the law." "I did," Elias said softly. He looked down at his massive, scarred hands. "A man's got to stand for something higher than his own fists, Clara. Or else he really is just the beast they say he is." He reached out. He gently took her arm. "Come on. Let's get you inside the house. You've got a clinic to build." The thaw came a week later. Winter didn't give up easy. It fought a retreating battle, leaving behind fields of thick gray mud and swollen creeks. But the sun lingered a little longer each afternoon. The icicles clinging to the porch roof dripped a steady rhythm, like a ticking clock. The main house was a disaster. Jebediah and his sons had torn the place apart looking for the will while Clara was locked in the barn. Bookshelves were tipped over. Mattresses were slashed. The fine china Clara had brought from back east was smashed across the kitchen floor. It looked like a tornado had swept through the parlor. Elias didn't say a word when they first walked through the front door. He just rolled up his sleeves. For 7 days they worked. They worked from sunup until the kerosene lamps burned out. Elias did the heavy lifting. He righted the heavy oak armoires like they were made of balsa wood. He chopped a mountain of firewood to keep the iron stove blazing. He repaired the shattered front door, fitting new hinges with hands that looked entirely too large for such delicate work. Clara swept. She scrubbed. She organized. She found her late husband's medical bags hidden beneath a floorboard in the bedroom. She began laying out the glass bottles, the bandages, the surgical steel instruments. She lined them up on the long dining room table. It wasn't a dining room anymore. It was the beginning of a ward. They fell into a rhythm, a quiet, steady partnership. Elias would fetch water from the well. Clara would boil it. They didn't talk much during the day. The work required all their breath. But in the evenings, things changed. The evenings belonged to the fire. It was a Tuesday night. The wind was howling outside, but inside the parlor it was warm. Clara sat in a rocking chair by the hearth. She was stitching a torn blanket. Her belly rested comfortably in her lap. The baby was kicking softly. Elias sat on the rug near the fire. He was too big for any of the delicate parlor chairs. He seemed to prefer the floor anyway. It felt grounded. He was holding a small, leather-bound book. Clara watched him over the rim of her sewing glasses. Elias had found the book while writing a fallen shelf 3 days ago. He had wiped the dust off it carefully. And every night since, he would sit by the fire, open the book to the exact same page, and just stare at it. His thick brows would knit together. His scarred lips would move silently. But he never turned the page. Clara set her needle down. Elias? He jumped slightly. He snapped the book shut. He looked guilty, like a child caught stealing a pie from the windowsill. Yes, ma'am. What are you reading? She asked gently. Elias looked down at the embossed leather cover. He rubbed his thumb over the gold lettering. He hesitated. The silence stretched out for a long time. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the flames. I ain't reading, Clara, he said. His voice was thick with shame. I'm just looking at the shapes. Clara felt a soft ache in her chest. She stood up slowly. She walked over to the small wooden desk in the corner of the room. She opened the top drawer. She took out a smooth slate board and a stick of white chalk. She walked back to the fire. She knelt on the rug right beside him. Elias shrank back slightly. He pulled his knees up. The giant looked small in that moment, vulnerable. They never taught me, Elias whispered, his voice defensive. The folks who took me in when I was orphaned. They put me to work in the livery stables when I was 8. Said a boy my size was built for lifting, not for thinking. Said books would just make me lazy, make me soft. He ran a hand over his scarred face. I guess they were right. A man like me don't have no business with books. Clara felt a flash of pure, hot anger. Not at Elias, but at the men who had stolen his mind to use his back. She placed the slate board on the rug between them. She handed him the stick of chalk. It looked ridiculously small in his massive, bruised fingers. Elias, look at me, Clara said. Her voice was firm, commanding. He slowly turned his head. His eyes were shadowed. They lied to you, Clara said clearly. She didn't mince her words. She wanted this to sink into his bones. They didn't keep you from school because you were built for lifting. They kept you from school because they were terrified of you. Elias frowned. Terrified? I was just a kid. They were terrified of what happens when a strong man realizes his own worth, Clara said. She pointed a finger at the book in his lap. Education is power, Elias. It is the greatest equalizer in this world. It is the only way a man can truly stand tall, not by the height of his shoulders, but by the reach of his mind. She leaned closer. The firelight caught the determination in her eyes. The men who run this territory, men like my father-in-law, they want to keep the working hands ignorant. They want to keep men like you illiterate, because an illiterate man can't read a contract. An illiterate man can't read the ledger at the company store to see he's being cheated. An illiterate man can't read the law to know his own rights. Ignorance is the chain they use to keep you tied to their plows. Elias stared at her. His breath caught. He had never thought of it that way. He always thought he was just stupid. He never realized his ignorance was a cage someone else had built for him. Education is a universal human right, Elias, Clara said softly, her anger fading into deep compassion. It doesn't belong to the rich. It doesn't belong to the men in the fine suits. It belongs to anyone with a mind and a soul, and you have a beautiful, honorable soul. She tapped the slate board. No one is ever going to use you again. You are going to learn to read the law. You are going to learn to read the ledgers for this clinic. You are going to be a free man in every sense of the word. Elias looked at the chalk in his hand. His knuckles were white. His hand was trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming wave of hope. A hope he had buried deep down a long, long time ago. "Where do we start?" he asked. His voice cracked. Clara smiled. It was a warm, brilliant smile that reached her tired eyes. She reached over. She guided his massive hand with her small, steady one. She pressed the tip of the chalk to the black slate. "We start at the very beginning," she said softly. She guided his hand up at an angle, then down at an angle, then a line across the middle. A sharp, stark letter A sat on the board. "A," Clara said. "A," Elias repeated. His voice was a low rumble, reverent, like he was speaking a prayer in church. They sat there for 2 hours. The fire burned down to glowing red embers. The wind battered the windows. But inside, Elias learned. He learned B. He learned C. He struggled to grip the chalk. He broke 2 pieces by pressing too hard. He got frustrated. He ran his hands through his thick hair. But Clara never rushed him. She never sighed. She just handed him another piece of chalk. She spoke words of encouragement. She treated his mind with the exact same gentle care she used when she bandaged his frozen hands a week prior. By midnight, the slate was covered in white dust. Elias wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He looked exhausted, more exhausted than he looked after chopping a cord of wood. Thinking was hard work. "Let's stop for tonight," Clara said gently. She began to pack up her sewing. "You did incredibly well, Elias, truly." Elias didn't put the chalk down. He stared at the board. He carefully wiped a section clean with his thumb. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to draw. He didn't draw random letters. He drew a tall line with 3 horizontal bars across it. Then an L. Then a single vertical line. An A. And finally, a winding, snake-like S. Elias. He stared at the letters. His letters. His name. For 35 years he had been called boy. He had been called giant. He had been called freak and monster and drifter. But looking at the slate, seeing the stark white chalk against the black background, he finally saw proof that he existed. He wasn't just a shadow on the frontier. He was a man. He had a name, and he had written it himself. Elias looked up at Clara. The hard, violent lines of his face had softened entirely. In the dying light of the fire, a single tear tracked its way down his scarred cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. "Thank you, Clara," he whispered. Clara reached out. She placed her hand gently over his massive, chalk-covered knuckles. "You're welcome, Elias. Now get some rest. Tomorrow, we build the clinic, and we learn F Outside, the snow continued to melt. The earth was softening. The foundation was finally set. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It fought its way into the valley. The snow turned to slush. The slush turned to a thick, sucking mud. The kind of mud that pulled the boots right off a man's feet. But the air was getting warmer. The frozen earth was finally breathing. The clinic was ready. Elias had built sturdy wooden beds. Clara had boiled down the surgical tools. They had rolled clean white bandages. They had painted a simple red cross on a wooden sign and hung it by the main road. Now they waited, but nobody came. The town was afraid. Jebediah had spread his poison deep. He told the sheriff the clinic was a scam. He told the store owner Elias was a wanted killer. He told the church folks Clara had lost her mind and taken up with a monster. So the road to the clinic stayed empty. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The rain was drumming a steady beat against the tin roof. Clara was in the kitchen. She was grinding dried willow bark in a stone mortar. She heard the back door open. Elias stepped inside. He was drenched. He had been out fixing the perimeter fence. He leaned his heavy rifle against the wall. He kicked off his muddy boots. He took one step toward the stove and he stumbled. It wasn't a trip. It was a collapse. His massive knees buckled. He caught himself on the edge of the wooden table. His knuckles turned white. He let out a sharp, ragged hiss through his teeth. Clara dropped the pestle. She rushed over. "Elias, sit down." She didn't ask what was wrong. She pulled a heavy wooden chair out. She guided his massive frame into it. He slumped forward. He was breathing hard. Sweat was mixing with the rainwater on his forehead. "It's nothing," Elias grunted. His voice was tight, strained. "Just pulled a muscle. Mud is thick today." "You are a terrible liar," Clara said softly. She walked around to his left side. She reached out and touched his ribs. Elias flinched violently. He pulled away. "Take off the coat, Elias." "Clara, I'm fine." "Take off the coat, or I will cut it off you with my trauma shears. You know I will do it." Elias looked at her. Her eyes left absolutely no room for argument. Slowly, painfully, he unbuttoned the heavy sheepskin coat. He let it drop to the floor. Underneath, he wore a faded flannel shirt. The left side of the shirt was dark, wet. But it wasn't rain. It was blood. Clara's breath hitched. She quickly unbuttoned his shirt. She peeled the wet fabric back from his skin. What she saw made her heart drop. It wasn't a new wound. It was an old one, from the night of the blizzard. When he had carried the frozen pine wood, a jagged splinter had dug deep into his side. He had pulled it out himself. He hadn't said a word. He had just kept working. Now, weeks later, the wound was infected. Angry red lines spider-webbed across his ribs. But that wasn't what stopped Clara cold. It was the rest of his back. As the shirt slipped off his shoulders, she saw the map of his life. His skin was a canvas of pure brutality. There were long, silvery whip marks crisscrossing his shoulder blades. There were jagged, puckered scars from knife fights. There were burn marks. He didn't have an inch of smooth skin. He looked like a man who had been fed through a meat grinder and somehow survived. Elias felt her staring. He hung his head. His thick shoulders hunched forward. He tried to pull the shirt back up. He wanted to hide. "Don't look," Elias whispered. His voice was thick with shame. "I know, it's ugly. I'm ugly." Clara gently slapped his hand away from the shirt. "Keep it off," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady, clinical, calm. She walked to the stove. She poured boiling water into a tin basin. She added a few drops of iodine. The water turned a deep, rusty brown. She grabbed a clean rag and a bar of lye soap. She walked back to him. She knelt beside his chair. "This is going to burn," she said. She pressed the hot, soaked rag against the infected wound on his ribs. Elias gripped the edge of the table. The wood groaned under his massive strength. His entire body went rigid, but he didn't make a sound. Clara worked in silence. She cleaned the infection. She cut away the dead tissue. She applied a thick paste of ground willow bark and honey to draw out the poison. Then she wrapped clean white cotton bandages around his massive chest. When she was finished, she didn't stand up. She stayed kneeling beside him. She took a clean, warm cloth. She reached up. Very gently, she began to wash the dried blood and mud from his back, from the old scars. Elias stiffened again, not from pain this time, but from the touch. Nobody touched him gently, ever. Hands only came at him in fists, or holding weapons. The sensation of a soft, warm cloth moving carefully over his ruined skin was completely alien. It terrified him more than a gun barrel. "You don't have to do that," Elias said. His voice was shaking. "I know," Clara said quietly. She traced a long, horrific scar across his right shoulder. "What happened here, Elias?" Elias closed his eyes. He swallowed hard. "Montana," he rasped. 10 years ago. I was sleeping in a barn. A horse went missing. The rancher found me. Didn't ask questions. Just tied me to a wagon wheel. Used a bullwhip. 30 lashes. Said a beast like me was bound to be a thief. They found the horse the next day. It had just wandered off." He let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "They didn't apologize. They just cut me loose and told me to run. I ran." Clara moved the cloth to a jagged, star-shaped scar on his lower back. "And this one?" "Wyoming, mining camp. A drunken foreman thought it would be funny to press a branding iron to my back while I was holding up a support beam. If I dropped the beam, the roof would cave in on 6 men. So I held it." He hung his head lower. His massive hands trembled. "It ain't the pain, Clara," he whispered into the quiet kitchen. "The pain goes away. A broken bone knits, a burn turns to a scab. You learn to live with the physical hurt, but it's the eyes, the way they look at you while they do it, like you ain't human, like you're just a piece of meat. That's the part that doesn't heal." He finally looked at her. His cold, hardened eyes were entirely broken. "I'm tired, Clara. I'm so goddamn tired of being strong." Clara stopped washing. She dropped the cloth into the basin. She reached out with both hands. She placed them flat against his scarred, broad chest. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She held his gaze. "Listen to me, Elias," Clara said. Her voice was a steady, rhythmic beat in the quiet room. "Listen to the words I am saying. You do not have to be an iron wall in this house. You do not have to swallow your pain just to make other people feel safe." She moved one hand up to his face. She gently cupped his scarred cheek. Scars on the skin fade, but humiliation bleeds into the soul. You have carried the cruelty of an entire territory on your back for 35 years. You don't have to be strong every second of the day. Not here. Allowing yourself to weep for your own pain is the very first step to healing, Elias. It is the only way to wash the poison out." Elias stared at her. Her eyes were full of a fierce, protective empathy. She wasn't pitying him. She was validating him. She was telling him he had a right to be broken. Something deep inside the giant cowboy snapped. It wasn't a loud break. It was a silent, shattering release. The dam he had built when he was 8 years old finally gave way. Elias slumped forward. He buried his massive, scarred face into Clara's shoulder, and he began to cry. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was heavy, guttural, the sound of decades of grief, humiliation, and loneliness being dragged out into the light. His massive shoulders shook violently. He gripped the fabric of her dress like a drowning man holding a lifeline. Clara didn't say a word. She didn't shush him. She just wrapped her arms around his wide back. She held him. She rocked him slightly, the way a mother rocks a terrified child. She let him ruin her dress with his tears. She let him be weak. They stayed like that for a long time. The rain continued to pound against the tin roof, washing the mud from the valley. Inside, by the warmth of the stove, the giant was finally washing the mud from his soul. It was a month later, late May. The mud had dried into hard, cracked ruts on the road. The wildflowers were blooming in the high pastures, but the clinic remained empty. The boycott held strong. It was near midnight. The house was pitch black. Then the pounding started. It was frantic, desperate. Someone was beating on the heavy front door with both fists. Elias was out of his bed before his eyes were fully open. He didn't bother grabbing a lantern. He moved through the dark house like a shadow. He grabbed the heavy Winchester rifle from its hook by the door. He levered around into the chamber with a sharp metallic clack. He pulled the door open just a crack. He kept his body hidden behind the thick oak wood. Standing on the porch was a woman. She was soaked in cold night sweat. Her hair was wild. She wasn't wearing shoes, just dirty wool stockings. It was Sarah, Jebediah's daughter-in-law, the wife of one of the men who had come to the barn with shovels to scrape Clara off the floor. She was crying hysterically. She held a lantern that shook violently in her hand. "Please," Sarah screamed into the dark gap of the door. "Please, is she here? Is the widow here?" Elias pushed the door open entirely. He stood in the frame, a towering wall of muscle and scars. Sarah gasped. She took a step back, terrified, but desperation overrode her fear. "My boy," she sobbed. "My little Tommy. He's choking. The strangling angel, he can't breathe. His throat is swollen shut. His lips are blue. Please, God, you have to help him." Clara appeared in the hallway behind Elias. She wore a thick robe over her nightgown. She carried a kerosene lamp. "Diphtheria," Clara said. Her voice was instantly sharp, focused. "Yes." Sarah dropped to her knees on the porch boards. "The town doctor. He's drunk. He won't ride out in the dark. Jebediah said to let the boy be in God's hands. He said it was pride. He forbade my husband from coming here, so I ran. I ran 2 miles through the brush. Please. He's 5 years old." Clara didn't hesitate. She turned on her heel. "Saddle the horses, Elias. Bring the wagon. It's faster than riding double in the dark." Elias grabbed Clara's arm. His grip was loose, but his arm was like an iron bar. He stopped her in her tracks. He looked down at her. His scarred face was carved in granite. The soft man from the kitchen was gone. This was the frontier survivor. "Clara, stop!" Elias pointed a finger at Sarah. "This woman's husband stood in the snow and smiled while you were freezing in a barn. Her father-in-law held a gun to your chest. They want you dead. They starved this clinic out. This is a trap. And even if it ain't a trap, they don't deserve your mercy." Sarah sobbed louder into the wood of the porch. "He's right. We are wicked. But my baby didn't do anything." Clara looked at Elias. The kerosene lamp threw flickering shadows across their faces. "Let go of my arm, Elias." He didn't move. "Clara, if we ride onto Jebediah's land in the dead of night, they will shoot us on sight. I can't protect you in the dark against 10 ranch hands with rifles." Clara took a step closer to him. She didn't shout. She spoke with a quiet, terrifying authority. "I understand the risk, and I understand your anger. They are cruel people. But look at me, Elias." He met her eyes. "The sins of adults shouldn't be paid for by a child," Clara said, her voice ringing out clearly in the cold night air. The words were distinct, deliberate. In medicine and in humanity, there is absolutely no room for vengeance. If we let that boy choke to death tonight just to spite his grandfather, then we are no better than the men who locked me in that barn." She reached out and placed her hand over his massive hand on his rifle. "We are not saving an enemy tonight, Elias. We are protecting a human being's right to live. That child has a right to breathe. That right supersedes every feud, every hatred, and every drop of bad blood in this valley. Now, hitch the wagon." Elias stared into her eyes. He saw the absolute, unshakable foundation of her soul. She believed every single word she said. She was willing to die for those words. Slowly, his grip loosened. He nodded once. "I'll get the horses." 10 minutes later, the wagon was tearing down the dirt road. Elias drove the team hard. The leather reins slapped the horses' backs like pistol shots. Clara sat beside him, clutching her black medical bag to her chest. They reached Jebediah's ranch in record time. The main house was lit up like a beacon. Men were standing on the porch. Elias hauled back on the reins. The wagon skidded to a halt in the dirt courtyard. Dust plumed up into the lantern light. Before the wagon even fully stopped, Jebediah stepped off the porch. He held a double-barreled shotgun. He pointed it squarely at Elias's chest. 3 ranch hands raised rifles behind him. "Get off my land, drifter," Jebediah roared. "I told you what would happen if you ever came back here." Sarah practically threw herself off the wagon bed. She ran to Jebediah. "I brought her. Tommy is dying. Put the gun down." Jebediah shoved Sarah aside. "I'd rather see my grandson with the Lord than let this witch touch him to gloat over our family." Elias wrapped the reins around the brake lever. He stood up in the wagon box. He was a terrifying sight. A giant backlit by the moon. He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't draw his 6-shooter. He simply stepped off the wagon. He hit the dirt with a heavy thud. He started walking directly toward Jebediah. Jebediah cocked both hammers of the shotgun. Click, click. "I will blow you in half," the old man screamed. Elias didn't stop. He walked right up to the twin barrels of the shotgun. He let the cold steel press directly against the center of his chest. He looked down at Jebediah. "Your grandson is choking on his own throat upstairs," Elias rumbled. His voice was perfectly calm. "The woman behind me has a silver tube in her bag that will let him breathe. You pull those triggers, I die. And then my body pins you to the ground while your grandson suffocates. Or you lower the gun, and we walk inside." Jebediah was trembling. His finger was tight on the trigger. The hate in his eyes was blinding. But Elias didn't blink. He just waited. The giant who used to fight for survival was now risking his life completely unarmed for the child of his enemy. Slowly, agonizingly, the pressure of Elias's chest pushed the shotgun barrels down. Jebediah stepped back. His face was pale, defeated. Clara jumped down from the wagon. She didn't look at the guns. She didn't look at Jebediah. She ran straight through the crowd of armed men, into the house and up the stairs, following the horrifying sound of a child gasping for air. Elias followed right behind her. He stood in the doorway of the child's bedroom. He filled the entire frame, acting as a living, breathing door to keep the men out. Inside the room, it was a nightmare. The 5-year-old boy was thrashing on the bed. His face was purple. He was drowning in the air. Clara didn't panic. Her hands were lightning fast. She opened the black bag. "Hold his head still, Sarah. Do not let him flinch." Clara pulled out a small scalpel. She wiped the child's neck with iodine. She didn't have time for anesthesia. She didn't have time for comfort. With one precise, terrifying motion, she made a small incision at the base of the boy's throat. Blood welled up. She quickly inserted a small, curved silver tube into the windpipe. A sharp whistling sound filled the room. It was the sound of air rushing into dying lungs. The boy's thrashing stopped immediately. His chest heaved up and down. The purple color slowly began to drain from his cheeks, replaced by a pale, healthy pink. He opened his eyes. He looked up at Clara and blinked. Sarah collapsed across the bottom of the bed, weeping uncontrollably, thanking God over and over. Clara let out a long breath. She wiped her hands on a towel. She packed her instruments back into the bag. She turned and walked to the doorway. Elias stepped aside to let her pass. Jebediah was standing in the hallway. He had heard the whistling breath. He knew what had happened. He looked at Clara. The shotgun was hanging uselessly by his side. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Clara didn't wait for a thank you. She didn't demand an apology. She looked at the old man. Her expression was completely unreadable. "Keep the tube clean with boiling water," Clara said evenly. "Bring him to the clinic in 3 days so I can remove it. Do not be late." She walked past him. She walked down the stairs out the front door and climbed back onto the wagon. Elias followed. He untied the reins. He looked at the ranch hands. They were all staring at Clara with a mix of awe and deep, profound shame. The spell of hatred had been broken. Elias snapped the reins. The wagon turned into the dark road, heading back toward the clinic. They had passed the test, and the town would never be the same. The silver tube came out 3 days later. Sarah brought little Tommy to the clinic. She didn't come in the dead of night this time. She drove a wagon right up the main road in broad daylight. She walked him through the front door. The boy was pale, but he was breathing. On his own. Clara removed the tube. She stitched the small incision. She handed Sarah a tin of drawing salve. Sarah didn't offer money. She knew Clara wouldn't take it. Instead, she placed a basket of fresh chicken eggs on the table. She looked at Clara. Then she looked at Elias, who was standing quietly in the corner. She gave a small, jerky nod. Then she took her boy and left. That basket of eggs cracked the ice. The next morning, an indentured ranch hand showed up with a broken arm. 2 days later, a Navajo woman brought her father, who was burning with a deep chest fever. By the end of the week, the clinic had a steady trickle of folks. But it wasn't a victory parade. The people came because they were desperate. They came because they were poor, but they didn't come with open arms. They whispered. They whispered in the waiting room. They whispered in the mercantile in town. They whispered over the church pews. They looked at Clara with a mix of respect and deep suspicion. How could a decent widow woman live out here alone? And worse, how could she live with him? They looked at Elias like he was a loaded gun with a hair trigger when he walked into the clinic waiting room to bring firewood. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men dropped their eyes to the floor. They saw his size. They saw the brutal, jagged scars crossing his face. They saw a monster. Elias felt it. Every single glance, it was like sandpaper on a sunburn. It was a hot Thursday afternoon. The waiting room was full. 6 people sat on the wooden benches Elias had built. The front door didn't open. It was kicked open. Sheriff Miller walked in. He was a thick, heavy-set man. He wore a silver star pinned to a pristine leather vest. His boots were clean. Too clean for a man who supposedly rode the rough country. He chewed a cigar right down to the nub. Behind him walked 3 deputies. They all had their hands resting on their gun belts. The waiting room went dead silent. Clara stepped out of the examination room. She wiped her hands on a white towel. "Can I help you, Sheriff?" she asked. Her voice was cool, level. Miller took his hat off, but he didn't do it out of respect. He did it to wipe the sweat from his balding head. "Afternoon, widow," Miller drawled. He looked around the room. He sneered at the poor folks sitting on the benches. "I'm not here for a remedy. I'm here on official town business. We got a complaint." "A complaint?" "Yes, ma'am. About a vagrant, a dangerous element." Miller didn't look at Clara. He looked right past her. He looked at the kitchen doorway. Elias was standing there. He had to duck to keep his head from hitting the doorframe. He held a stack of clean, folded blankets. He didn't move. "I'm talking to you, boy," Miller barked. He dropped his hand to the butt of his Colt revolver. "Step out here." Elias slowly set the blankets down. He stepped into the waiting room. The floorboards groaned under his boots. The patients on the benches shrank back. "You've been in my town for 2 months," Miller said. He stepped closer, puffing his chest out, trying to look big. He still only came up to Elias's chest. "I ran a wire to the marshal's office up north. Asked about a giant with a ruined face. Turns out your name is attached to a whole lot of bar fights, assaults, trouble." "I never started a fight in my life," Elias rumbled. "Don't talk back to me," Miller snapped. "You're a drifter, a thug, and decent folks in this town are terrified of you. Jebediah filed a formal complaint, said you threatened him with a rifle. I'm declaring you a public menace." Clara stepped between them. Her eyes were flashing with pure anger. "He threatened Jebediah because Jebediah was pointing a gun at my chest, Sheriff. Elias works for me. He is a free citizen. He is reading the law. He is learning. You have absolutely no right to remove him." Miller laughed, an ugly, wet sound. "Reading the law, this beast? Don't make me laugh, widow. You can put a suit on a bear, but it'll still tear your throat out. Look at him, look at that face. That's the face of a killer. Now step aside." Miller drew his gun. He pointed it right at Elias's stomach. You got 1 hour to pack your saddle, giant. You ride out of this valley. If I see you at sundown, I'll shoot you where you stand. Elias looked at the gun. He looked at the trembling patients. He looked at Clara. Her pregnant belly was large now. She was so close to term. The stress was too much for her. Elias felt the old familiar weight settle over his shoulders. The weight of leaving. It was easier to run. It was easier to just be the monster they wanted him to be. If he left, the town would leave Clara alone. Her clinic would survive. "All right," Elias said softly. He raised his massive hands in surrender. "I'll go." "No!" Clara grabbed his arm. "Elias, do not do this." Elias looked down at her. His eyes were heartbreakingly sad. "It's the only way, Clara. They ain't never gonna see past the scars. I'm poison to this place." He started to step around her, but then he stopped. He looked at the slate board resting on the front desk. He saw the chalk dust. He remembered the night he wrote his own name. He remembered the promise Clara made him. "You have a right to be here. You are a man." Elias slowly turned back around. He lowered his hands. He didn't look at Clara. He looked directly at Sheriff Miller. Then he swept his cold, hard gaze over the deputies, and finally over every single patient sitting in the room. He took a deep breath. His chest expanded. When he spoke, his voice wasn't a rumble. It was thunder. It shook the glass in the window panes. "No," Elias said. Sheriff Miller cocked the hammer of his gun. Click. "What did you say to me, boy?" "I said no." Elias took one step forward. The barrel of the gun touched his shirt. He didn't care. "I am not running. Not today. Not ever again." He pointed a thick finger right at Miller's face. "You want to talk about danger, Sheriff? Let's talk about it. Let's make it very clear for everyone in this room." Elias raised his voice. He wanted the people on the benches to hear every single syllable. He wanted the educational truth to hit them like a physical blow. "You judge a man's worth by his ragged clothes and his scarred face?" Elias demanded. His voice was raw with 35 years of pain. "You look at my broken nose and you call me a monster. But let me tell you what real monsters look like." He pointed toward the wealthy side of town. "Real monsters wear silk vests. They sit in the front row of the church. Those men, the ones paying your salary, Sheriff. They threw a pregnant widow out into a freezing blizzard to die. They did it for dirt. They did it for money. They locked her in a barn and went to sleep in warm beds." Elias struck his own massive chest with his fist. The sound was like a hammer hitting an anvil. "While those decent men left her to die, this monster broke his hands chopping wood to keep her warm. I gave her the coat off my back. I took a splinter in my ribs to keep her breathing." He looked at the mothers clutching their children. "Prejudice is a disease," Elias stated clearly. The words hung in the air, undeniable and heavy. "It is a sickness that rots the brain. You are teaching your children to fear a man because of the shape of his jaw, while you tip your hats to the men who would steal the boots off your feet. Your prejudice is the real disease in this town. It blinds you to the truth. A man's character is built by his actions, not his appearance. I have bled for this clinic. I have swept its floors. I am staying right here." The silence in the room was absolute. Sheriff Miller's hand was shaking. Not from anger, from fear, because the giant wasn't just big anymore. He was righteous. And the people on the benches were listening. A few of the men were actually nodding slowly. Miller realized he had lost the crowd. If he shot an unarmed man right now after a speech like that, the town might string him up. Miller slowly uncocked his gun. He slid it back into his holster. "You're making a mistake, widow," Miller muttered. But the bluster was gone. He looked small. "Jebediah ain't gonna let this stand." "Then let him come," Clara said proudly. "But you are no longer welcome in my clinic, Sheriff. Get out." Miller swallowed hard. He turned. He and his deputies walked out the door. They didn't kick it this time. They closed it quietly. Elias stood in the center of the room. His chest was heaving. He had never spoken like that in his life. He expected the patients to run away. Instead, an old farmer in the corner slowly stood up. He walked over to Elias. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a worn wooden pipe. "You fixing that broken fence out back, son?" the old man asked quietly. Elias blinked. "Yes, sir." "Well," the farmer said, "I got a good hammer in my wagon. Let's go get it done." Elias looked at Clara. She was smiling. Tears were pooling in her eyes. The whispers hadn't completely stopped. But for the first time, they weren't whispering about a monster. They were whispering about a man. The heat of late June settled over the valley like a thick woolen blanket. It was midnight. The air was absolutely still. The crickets had stopped chirping. That was the first sign. Nature always goes quiet when wolves are prowling. Inside the clinic, the heat was suffocating. Clara lay in her bed on the first floor. She was awake. Her hands rested on her enormous belly. The baby was restless, heavy. The dull ache in her lower back had been building for 2 days. She knew the time was close, very close. Elias was not asleep. He sat on the front porch in the dark. He didn't sit in a chair. He sat on the rough wooden floorboards, his back against the wall. His Winchester rifle rested across his thighs. He felt the shift in the air. Then the clinic dogs down the road started barking, frantic, angry barks. A second later, a dog yelped, a sharp, high-pitched squeal. Then, dead silence. Someone had just cut a dog's throat. Elias stood up. He moved with a terrifying grace for a man his size. He slipped inside the front door. He locked it. He didn't light a lantern. "Clara," he whispered down the hall. "I'm awake," her voice came back, tight with pain. "I hear them." "Stay on the floor. Slide under the heavy oak bed frame. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." "Elias." "Do it, Clara." Elias moved to the kitchen window. He peeked through the slit in the wooden shutters. Down by the tree line, shadows were moving. 5 of them, maybe 6. They weren't Sheriff Miller's deputies. They didn't walk like lawmen. They slinked like coyotes. They carried long rifles. But worse, 2 of them carried burlap sacks. Elias smelled it before he saw it. The sharp, chemical stench of kerosene. Jebediah had run out of legal options. The spring courts were opening in 3 days. The true will was going to be officially filed. The town was starting to respect the giant. Jebediah was losing his grip. So he hired men from out of territory, hired guns, arsonists. They were going to burn the clinic to the ground with Clara inside. Elias felt a cold, hard rage settle in his stomach. The old Elias would have stepped onto the porch and started firing. He would have gunned them down in the dirt and slept like a baby. But he wasn't the old Elias. Clara had taught him about the law. She had taught him about the sanctity of life. He checked his rifle. He ejected the brass cartridge from the chamber. He caught it in his hand. He placed it in his pocket. He pushed the remaining bullets out of the loading gate. He was unloading his gun. He gripped the Winchester by the hot metal barrel. He swung it like a baseball bat. The heavy wooden stock felt good in his hands. Elias slipped out the back door. The hinges didn't make a sound. He had oiled them yesterday. He melted into the darkness of the backyard. The thugs split up. 3 went toward the barn. 2 crept toward the front porch. The leader, a wiry man with a dirty bandana over his face, walked right up to the side of the house. He started splashing kerosene against the dry wooden siding. The smell was overpowering. All it would take was 1 match. The leader reached into his pocket. He pulled out a sulfur match. He struck it against the sole of his boot. It flared yellow. He brought the match toward the soaked wood. A massive hand shot out of the darkness. It didn't grab the match. It grabbed the man's entire face. Elias crushed his thick fingers around the man's jaw. He lifted the thug entirely off his feet. The match fell into the damp dirt and fizzled out. Elias slammed the man back against the side of the house. The wood shuddered. The man's eyes rolled back in his head. He went limp instantly, 1 down. The sound alerted the others. "Hey! Over there!" a voice yelled from the front porch. 2 men came running around the corner. They raised their rifles. Elias didn't retreat. He charged. He was 6'6" and weighed nearly 300 pounds. He hit the first man like a runaway freight train, shoulders down. He slammed into the man's chest. Ribs cracked like dry kindling. The man flew backward off the porch into the rose bushes. The second man panicked. He fired wildly into the dark. Bang! The muzzle flash lit up the yard. The bullet grazed Elias's left bicep. It burned like a hot iron. Elias didn't even flinch. He stepped inside the man's guard. He swung the heavy wooden stock of his Winchester. It connected flush with the man's temple. A dull, sickening thwack. The man dropped like a stone. 3 down. Suddenly, a searing pain tore through Elias's right side. Bang! He stumbled forward. He dropped to one knee. The 2 thugs from the barn had flanked him. One of them had a smoking revolver. He had shot Elias squarely in the ribs. The bullet punched through the muscle and grazed a bone. Blood instantly soaked Elias's shirt. He tasted copper in his mouth. "Got him!" the shooter yelled. "Finish the freak!" The 2 men rushed forward. One drew a long hunting knife. The other cocked his rifle to fire again. Elias looked up. His vision blurred for a second. The pain was blinding, but then he heard a sound from inside the house. Clara screamed. It wasn't a scream of terror. It was a scream of agony. Her water had broken. The labor had started. Elias's eyes snapped clear. The darkness in him vanished. Only the mission remained. Protect the life in that house. He grabbed a handful of dirt. As the man with the knife lunged, Elias threw the dirt straight into his eyes. The man screamed and dropped his hands. Elias surged upward from his knee. He delivered a devastating uppercut to the man's chin. The thug flipped completely backward and landed in the mud, out cold. The last man, the shooter, backed away in sheer terror. He fumbled with his rifle lever. He couldn't believe the giant was still moving with a bullet in his side. Elias closed the distance in 2 strides. He grabbed the barrel of the rifle. He twisted it violently out of the man's hands. He threw it into the dark. Then Elias grabbed the man by his shirt collar. He threw him to the ground. He put his heavy boot dead center on the man's chest, pinning him to the dirt. Elias stood over him. He was bleeding heavily from his side. His massive chest heaved. He reached down and pulled his heavy steel revolver from his belt. He cocked the hammer. He aimed it right between the man's terrified eyes. The thug held up his hands, sobbing. "Don't! Please! I was just paid! I was just paid to do it!" Elias's finger tightened on the trigger. It would be so easy. It would be entirely justified. This man had come to burn a pregnant woman alive. He had put a bullet in Elias's ribs. The frontier law would call it self-defense. The old Elias would have pulled the trigger without a second thought. Elias looked at the gun. Then he listened. Through the open window of the house, he heard Clara groaning. He heard the chaotic, beautiful, painful sounds of new life fighting to enter the world. Elias took a deep breath. His hand trembled slightly, but his heart was completely steady. Slowly, Elias uncocked the revolver. He lowered the gun. He leaned down. He brought his scarred face inches from the terrified thug. "Listen to me very carefully," Elias rasped, his voice cutting through the dark like a blade. "I am sparing your life right now, but you need to know exactly why." He grabbed the man by the collar and hauled him up slightly. He stated the lesson with absolute crystal clarity. "I'm sparing your life, not because I'm weak. I have the power to end you right here in the dirt. I'm doing it because of the child about to be born in that house. That child deserves to inherit a world built on mercy, not cold-blooded revenge. If I kill you, I am teaching that child that violence is the only way to solve a problem. That is exactly what the cruel men in this town believe. We are building something better than that. You go back to Jebediah. You tell him the giant spared you. You tell him mercy is stronger than murder. Now get out of my sight before I change my mind." Elias threw the man back into the dirt. The thug scrambled to his feet. He didn't look back. He ran into the darkness as fast as his legs could carry him, leaving his unconscious friends behind. Elias watched him go. He felt a profound sense of peace wash over him, even as the blood dripped from his side. He had won, not just the fight. He had won the war for his own soul. He turned around. He limped heavily up the steps. He threw open the front door. "Clara!" he yelled, clutching his bleeding side. "In here!" she cried out from the bedroom. Elias stumbled into the room. Clara was on the floor, gripping the bedpost. She was sweating profusely. "They're gone," Elias gasped out, leaning against the doorframe for support. "It's safe." Clara looked at him. She saw the blood soaking his shirt. Her eyes went wide. But another contraction hit her, and she screamed again. "Elias!" she panted, her eyes squeezing shut. The baby is coming. Right now, I need you." Elias dropped his gun on the floor. He ignored the burning hole in his side. He crossed the room. The fight outside was over. The most important battle of the night was just beginning. And for the first time in his life, his massive hands weren't going to be used to destroy something. They were going to be used to catch a miracle. The bedroom was hot. It smelled of copper blood and harsh sweat. Clara gripped the iron rails of the bed frame. Her knuckles were bone white. She let out a long, ragged scream. The sound tore through the quiet house. Elias was on his knees beside the bed. He was dying. He knew it. The bullet had dug deep into his side. Blood was pouring out, soaking his trousers, pooling darkly on the wooden floor. Every time he took a breath, a sharp knife of fire twisted in his ribs. But he didn't look at his wound. He looked at Clara. "Elias," she gasped. Her head fell back against the damp pillow. "The baby. It's too soon. I can't." "You can," Elias rumbled. His voice was fading. He sounded like a machine running out of steam. "You're the strongest thing I ever met, Clara. You push." He reached out with his massive, trembling hands. They were covered in mud and his own blood. He didn't want to touch her clean sheets. He felt monstrous again. "Help me," she cried. Elias grabbed a clean towel from the nightstand. He pressed it against her forehead. He tried to remember everything she had taught him about medicine, but his brain was swimming in a dark, heavy fog. Then he heard it. Outside. The sound of horses, wagon wheels grinding against the dirt, and voices. Lots of them. Elias's blood ran cold. The thugs had come back, or Jebediah had brought his whole crew. Elias let go of the towel. He struggled to his feet. The room spun wildly. He gritted his teeth, swallowing back a groan of pure agony. He reached down and picked up his heavy steel revolver from the floorboards. "I won't let them in," Elias whispered. He swayed heavily on his feet. He staggered out of the bedroom. He left a trail of red droplets down the hallway. He reached the front door just as heavy boots hit the porch steps. Elias raised the gun with both hands. It felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He aimed right at the center of the wooden door. "Get away!" Elias roared. Or he tried to roar. It came out as a wet, desperate growl. The door didn't burst open. Somebody knocked, frantically. "Clara! Elias! Open the door!" It was a woman's voice. Elias frowned. His vision was swimming. He reached out and fumbled with the iron latch. He pulled the door open a few inches. Standing on the porch was Sarah, Jebediah's daughter-in-law. Behind her stood 20 people, the old farmer with the wooden pipe, the indentured hands from Jebediah's ranch, the Navajo woman from down the valley. Every single man was holding a rifle or a shotgun. They weren't pointing them at Elias. They had their backs to the house. They were facing the dark tree line, forming a solid armed wall around the clinic. Sarah saw the blood soaking Elias's side. She saw the gun trembling in his hands. She pushed right past him into the hallway. 2 other women from the town followed her, carrying bundles of clean cloth and boiling kettles. "The shooting woke the whole valley," Sarah said rapidly. She grabbed Elias by his massive shoulder. "Put the gun down, giant. We have the watch." Elias couldn't comprehend it. He stared at the armed men on his porch, men who had crossed the street to avoid him just a week ago. Now they were standing guard in the dead of night. "Why?" Elias rasped. He dropped the heavy revolver. It clattered to the floor. His legs finally gave out. The old farmer stepped inside. He caught Elias by the arm, keeping the giant from hitting the floor entirely. He eased Elias down against the hallway wall. Sarah looked at Elias. She looked him dead in the eyes. "Because we are done being cowards," Sarah said clearly. She didn't whisper. She spoke the truth loud enough for the men outside to hear it. She pointed a finger toward Clara's bedroom, where another agonizing groan echoed out. "Listen to me, Elias," Sarah said, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. "You and Clara taught this town a lesson we should have known all along. You used compassion to break our selfishness. She saved my boy's life when my own family told me to let him die. You stood up to a mob without firing a shot. Today, this community stands up to protect you." Sarah knelt down in the blood. She looked directly into Elias's fading eyes. She made sure he heard the lesson. No one has the right to trample on another's life ever again. Not for land, not for money, and not because of blind prejudice. We are bound together by the good we do for each other. That is the only law that matters now. The law of human decency. We are your neighbors, and we protect our own. Elias closed his eyes. A single hot tear mixed with the sweat on his scarred face. He wasn't a drifter anymore. He was home. "She's in the bedroom," Elias whispered, his head rolling to the side. "I know," Sarah said. She stood up. She looked at the old farmer. "Keep pressure on that wound, Silas. Don't let this man die. That's an order." Sarah ran into the bedroom. For the next hour, the house was a battlefield. But the enemy wasn't men with guns. The enemy was death itself. In the hallway, the old farmer and an indentured hand stripped Elias's bloody shirt away. They poured raw whiskey over his bullet wound. Elias screamed, his massive hands digging gouges into the wooden floor. They packed the wound with clean gauze. They bound his chest tight. In the bedroom, Sarah took charge. She had birthed 4 children of her own. She knew the rhythm of life. "Breathe, Clara," Sarah commanded. She held Clara's hand tightly. "You push the darkness out. You bring the light in. Do it now." Outside, the men stood like stone statues. They watched the tree line. Nobody came out of the dark. Jebediah's hired thugs had run, and they weren't coming back to face a united town. The night stretched on. The moon sank low behind the western ridge. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple. And then the quiet morning air was shattered. It was a cry, sharp, angry, triumphant. It was the unmistakable sound of a newborn baby. In the hallway, Elias heard it. His eyes fluttered open. He was pale as a ghost, but he was breathing. He looked up at the old farmer. The farmer grinned around his wooden pipe. "Sounds like you got yourself a new boss, son," the farmer chuckled. Inside the bedroom, Sarah wrapped the tiny, squalling infant in a soft white blanket. She wiped the tears from Clara's exhausted face. "It's a boy, Clara," Sarah wept softly. "A beautiful, perfect little boy." Clara reached out her trembling arms. Sarah placed the baby on her chest. The child instantly quieted down, listening to the steady heartbeat of his mother. Clara kissed his tiny forehead. She looked at the bedroom door. "Elias," she whispered. The door slowly creaked open. Elias stood there. He was leaning heavily on the doorframe. His chest was wrapped in thick white bandages. He looked like he had been through a war. But his face was entirely transformed. The hard, bitter lines were completely gone. He shuffled into the room. He walked to the edge of the bed. He dropped to his knees. He didn't care about the pain in his ribs. He looked at the small bundle resting on Clara's chest. Clara smiled. She gently shifted the blanket. She looked down at Elias's massive, scarred hands resting on the edge of the mattress. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked softly. Elias pulled his hands back immediately. Panic flashed in his eyes. "No," Elias stammered. "My hands, they're too rough. I'm too big. I might break him." "Elias," Clara said firmly, Look at me." He met her eyes. "These hands built this clinic," she said. "These hands protected me. These hands are going to teach him how to read. They are the gentlest hands I know. Take him." Trembling, Elias reached out. He slid his massive palms under the tiny bundle. He lifted the baby up. The child was impossibly light, smaller than a loaf of bread. Elias pulled the baby to his chest. He cradled the boy against his uninjured side. The giant cowboy leaned his scarred face down, resting his cheek gently against the soft white blanket. The sun broke over the horizon. The golden light streamed through the bedroom window. It washed over the room, illuminating the blood, the sweat, and the absolute beauty of the morning. The storm was finally over. The seed had broken through the frozen ground. 6 months later. The air was crisp with the sharp chill of late November. The valley was painted in brilliant shades of gold and burnt orange. The clinic was completely unrecognizable. It wasn't a lonely farmhouse anymore. It was a bustling hub of life. 2 new wooden additions had been built onto the sides to accommodate the beds. Wagons were parked in the front yard. Horses were tied to a long, sturdy hitching post. The sign by the road didn't just have a red cross anymore. It had neat, beautifully painted white letters. The Frontier Free Clinic. All are welcome. Inside the waiting room, a fire roared in the hearth. The benches were full. An older Navajo man sat next to an Irish railroad worker. A poor dirt farmer sat next to a well-dressed merchant from town. There was no whispering. There were no sideways glances. The air was filled with the low, comfortable hum of shared humanity. Behind the front desk sat Elias. He wore a clean-pressed white shirt. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing his thick, scarred forearms. He wore wire-rimmed reading glasses perched on the bridge of his broken nose. He was holding a ledger book and a pencil. He looked up as the front door opened. A young ranch hand walked in, holding a bloody rag to a deep cut on his hand. Elias didn't scowl, he smiled. It was a warm, easy smile that completely erased the terror of his scars. "Morning, Jimmy," Elias said. His voice was still a deep rumble, but the gravel was gone. "Fence wire snap on you again?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Elias," the boy said respectfully. "Go on back to room 2. Clara will be right with you. And Jimmy, mind your boots. I just swept that floor." "Yes, sir." The boy hurried down the hall. Elias wrote the boy's name down in the ledger. His handwriting was large, clear, and perfectly legible. He had read through 3 law books since the summer. He managed the clinic's supplies. He handled the disputes. He was the anchor of the place. The back door of the clinic opened. Clara walked in. She looked radiant. The hollow exhaustion of her widowhood was entirely gone. She wore a simple blue dress, and her hair was pinned back neatly. In her arms, she held a 6-month-old baby boy, little Thomas. He was chubby, laughing, and reaching out with tiny hands. Clara walked up to the desk. She set the baby right on top of the open ledger. Thomas immediately grabbed Elias's pencil and threw it onto the floor with a happy shriek. Elias laughed, a deep booming sound that echoed through the waiting room. He reached out and scooped the baby up, lifting him high into the air. "You're a menace, Tommy," Elias grinned, letting the baby grab his nose. "Absolute menace." Clara leaned against the desk. She watched her husband with the child. They had been married quietly in the late summer, right on the front porch by the circuit judge, the same judge who had officially validated the true will. Jebediah was gone. The town had turned against him completely. When Sheriff Miller realized the people would no longer tolerate the corruption, he arrested Jebediah for hiring the men who tried to burn the clinic. The old man was sitting in a federal penitentiary down south. The massive ranch had been broken up. The indentured hands freed exactly as the will demanded. The valley had breathed a massive sigh of relief. "The supplies from the city train arrived this morning," Clara said. "We have enough ether and bandages to last through the winter." "I'll unload the wagons after lunch," Elias said. He settled Tommy onto his lap. He looked at Clara. "You look tired. You should sit down." "I am fine, Elias. We have good work to do." Later that evening, After the last patient had gone home and the clinic was quiet, Elias and Clara sat on the front porch. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the valley. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine needles. Tommy was fast asleep in a wooden crib Elias had built, right beside their rocking chairs. Elias reached out. He took Clara's hand. His massive fingers completely enveloped hers, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "It's peaceful," Elias said quietly, watching the stars begin to prick through the darkening sky. "I never thought I'd know what this word actually felt like. Peace." Clara squeezed his hand. She looked out at the empty road, remembering the brutal night she was locked in the barn. She remembered the freezing cold. She remembered the absolute despair. She turned to Elias. The firelight from inside the house illuminated his face. She saw the man he truly was, a man of honor, a protector, a father. "We built this together, Elias," Clara said softly. She wanted him to truly understand the weight of what they had accomplished. It wasn't just a building, it was a revolution. She spoke the words clearly, making sure the lesson was carved into the quiet night. "They threw me in this barn to bury a secret," Clara stated. Her voice was strong, carrying the undeniable truth of their journey. "They thought the cold would kill my spirit. They thought they could bury human decency under the snow. But they didn't realize that the most resilient seeds always sprout in the darkest, coldest places." She rested her head against his broad, solid shoulder. "Look at what we've done, Elias. Look at this clinic. Look at the people who walk through our doors today. The poor, the broken, the outcast. We didn't just build a hospital. We built a sanctuary." Clara looked up into his eyes. "Our love and this clinic are the living proof of the truth they tried to burn. It is the absolute proof that every single person is born with the equal right to live, the right to be respected no matter the scars they carry, and the right to be loved simply because they are human. That is the greatest medicine we will ever give this valley." Elias listened to her words. He let them wash over his soul. The last remnants of his old shame, the old belief that he was just a beast, vanished completely into the frontier night. He wrapped his massive arm around his wife. He pulled her close. He looked down at his sleeping son. "Yes, ma'am," Elias whispered into the quiet dark. "We surely did." The frontier was still wild. It was still harsh. But on this small plot of land in the shadow of the mountains, humanity had planted a flag, and it was never coming down. The story you're about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
Welcome to a channel dedicated to Western cowboy stories. Frontier love, maternal bonds, human compassion, and the deep connections between people in the harshest of worlds. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, share it with others, and subscribe to support more meaningful stories like this. As the dust settles over the valley and the echoes of gunfire fade into silence, what remains is not just the story of survival, but the triumph of humanity over cruelty. This journey was never only about a storm or a piece of land or even a fight against greed. It was about something far deeper. It was about a woman who refused to surrender her dignity, even when death stood at her doorstep. It was about a man the world had cast aside, who chose not to become the monster they believed him to be. And together they proved a truth that many fear to accept, that real strength is not found in domination or violence, but in compassion, integrity, and the courage to stand for what is right. The story reminds us that injustice often hides behind power, and cruelty can wear the face of family, authority, or tradition. Yet, even in such darkness, A single act of courage can ignite change. Clara stood her ground, not just for herself, but for the voiceless, for the workers, the poor, and those denied their basic dignity. Elias, a man shaped by pain and rejection, discovered that his worth was never defined by the scars on his body, but by the choices in his heart. And perhaps that is the most powerful message of all. We are not defined by what has been done to us, but by what we choose to do in return. There is also a quiet but profound lesson about equality woven into every moment of this story. The idea that every human life holds the same value is simple in words, yet revolutionary in practice. This belief threatened those in power because it challenged the very foundation of their control. And still, Clara and Elias chose to defend it, not with hatred, but with unwavering conviction. They remind us that justice is not just a concept written in law books. It is something that must be lived, protected, and sometimes fought for in the face of overwhelming opposition. At its core, this story is about healing. Healing from betrayal, from violence, from years of being unseen and unheard. It shows that true healing does not come from revenge, but from understanding, from compassion, and from allowing oneself to be vulnerable. Elias did not become strong by hardening his heart, but by finally allowing himself to feel, to learn, and to believe that he deserved more than the life he had been given. And in doing so, he didn't just change his own fate. He helped build a future where others could live with dignity and hope. For us, as listeners, the meaning is clear. In a world that often feels divided, where judgment comes quickly and empathy feels rare, we are given a choice every single day. We can choose to look at others through the lens of fear and prejudice, or we can choose to see their humanity. We can choose silence in the face of injustice, or we can choose to stand, even when it is difficult. And we can choose kindness, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. So as you walk away from this story, carry this with you. Strength is not in how hard you can strike, but in how firmly you can stand without losing your compassion. True power lies not in control, but in lifting others up. And even in the harshest, coldest places, whether in the wild frontier or within our own lives, there is always room for warmth, for justice, and for hope.